Hey, Scott Jordan here and Mark Warner for Jancast number 210 for April 2nd, 2026. Mark, it's so good to see a human because I've been interacting with AI for the last few Jancasts. I don't know if you've listened or not, but I've been having fun, with those guys.
Well, I'm totally humbled to be the follow-up guest to AI because AI is much smarter than me, Scott, for the record. Much
Oh,
smarter
no,
than
no,
me.
no, no. So we thought, it'd be an interesting show to kind of go back and document what happened, back on March 11th, 2020, the whole pandemic thing started. And we thought, just like we talked about on our, anniversary of 20 plus years, it ends up we created this historical document with Jancast over the years of the cleaning industry. And I thought, well, why don't we do the same thing with the pandemic? Because 10 years from now, people are going to forget about the pandemic, and this will be something that people can listen to, right? I mean, it's history.
Well, that's the best part. Even something you said to me a little earlier today is that what we're talking about today, 10 years from now, will be documentation of the next 10 years of evolution of the cleaning industry. And
Yeah,
that's pretty fascinating to me. That's why I love being part of this, man. Thank
yeah.
you for having me back on.
Hey, well,
Hello,
but
all Jcast.com listeners out there. Yay, I'm back.
yeah, he's back. So let's talk. You put in the show notes prior to the pandemic starting. So let's talk about that a little bit because I can talk about I experienced the beginning of the pandemic while I was surfing. But let's cover your
Well,
history because you go back before COVID, right?
well, the most interesting thing that I've thought about very much over the last half a dozen years is that in 2019, I was the education manager for ISSA.
Yeah.
And ISSA was contacted to send an instructor over to Beijing, China, because they wanted to get the latest and greatest and best practices for Western standards of care. So they selected me to go, and I ended up in Beijing, China, with multiple interpreters teaching a huge class of what was considered China's subject matter experts in the topics of cleaning and disinfection. And I taught that class for 5 days straight,
Wow.
like almost no breaks. They're very regimented on when they start and when they do their breaks. It was nonstop. And that was October of 2019.
Hmm.
And so often what's gone through my mind in the last half dozen years was it begs the question, why then? You
Yeah,
know,
when
obviously,
I went to Beijing, they had people who were staying at this beautiful hotel, and there's these ladies on their hands and knees wiping the floor with towels by hand. And I said, well, why don't they use like an auto scrubber? And they said, oh, it's much cheaper to use people.
yeah. Well, one of the things I definitely noticed while I was there is they have no fear of huge, massive crowds all shoulder to shoulder.
Hmm.
Getting on an elevator was a matter of if you turn your foot sideways, the door will close because there was so many people packed into an elevator. So
Yeah,
October of 2019, it was December of 2019, we heard about the outbreak in Wuhan, China.
yeah.
And, it kind of has you questioning, were they just coincidentally on top of wanting to kind of fine tune their game on infectious disease control, or did was
I'm
something
sure it's
already starting?
completely a coincidence, Mark. I don't know what you're talking
Yeah,
about.
but I mean, by January of 2020, we had our first case documented in the U.S., which was in Washington State, Seattle,
Yeah,
Oregon, one of the two states, Great Northwest, and by March of 2020, the whole world changed.
yeah, yeah.
And what's funny is you were surfing when the world changed.
Well, yeah, I was in Costa Rica at that point. I used to go to Costa Rica twice a year to surf, and my daughter was with me because she still works for me, doing our marketing and advertising and stuff. So we would usually surf in the morning and then have lunch and then do some work in the afternoon. So we're in it's like a little, not really a resort, but a small place that only had like 6 rooms for it. So the other people that were staying there kept saying, what are you and Nikki doing every morning? Because we were trying to handle all these. We're getting emails from people saying, can I buy thousands of bottles of disinfectant and everything else? We had no idea what was going on. And the people that were there, when you're in Costa Rica, you don't necessarily pay attention to the news. And there wasn't even like a television to watch the news if you even wanted to. The internet was hardly easy to get to. But people kept saying, "What are you doing?" And so we left. We left Costa Rica as planned, and the next week you couldn't even go to the beach down there because they'd shut the whole place down. So we got out just in time because otherwise we might not have been able to get out. So yeah, it was interesting to kind of not knowing at that point. We didn't have any idea what the heck was going on and what we're getting into, I mean,
So in other words, what you and Nikki were doing every day was trying to figure out how to get home or what was going on at home, right?
yeah. Well, mostly it was people realizing that disinfectants were important. Everybody and their brother back then wanted to buy whatever they could get.
Yeah.
So that was dealing with that. And then obviously we went into massive shortages and everything else that kind of tied in with it. But yeah, so you're over in China teaching them how to do stuff that they didn't even know was coming. I'm in Costa Rica surfing, not knowing what's going on. And then the rest is history. We just kind of lived through all this stuff. So that's why we want to kind of go through it year by year, to document it properly, because, 5 years from now, people might forget some of this stuff. So we're going to put it down, right?
Yeah, well, some of it seems like waking up from a nightmare.
Well,
When
and
you
you
think
get to
about,
going over all these notes, it's kind of like, oh, I forgot all about that, right?
yeah,
And the part that Jancast had in it. So let's get going here. We got a lot of stuff to cover because, we did a lot of good back then. We saved the world, right, Mark?
we saved lives.
So yeah, so lockdown began, massive shortages, all that. That's leading in the end of 2020, going into 21, and then hey, remember we didn't even have vaccines at that point, right?
Yeah, well, even the shift from 20 to 21 was interesting because there was this increase, this massive. I felt it because I lived in that world, but this massive increase in the demand for certification or some
Mm,
form of documentation
yeah,
that people involved with providing cleaning services knew what they were doing. Because the biggest fear was that if somebody didn't know what they were doing, they would potentially be the cause of spread of disease
yeah.
rather than, mitigating the spread of disease. So there was that gigantic push that was going on towards the end of 2020.
Yep.
And
Then,
then in
then
2021, I mean, we came out of the gate, Scott, with like the supermarkets having one-way signs on every aisle.
oh, that's right.
And
I forgot. There's one. That's one I forgot all about. It's like,
yeah,
really?
and then floor markers like if you're in line, stand
Yeah,
here,
yeah, that's right. You could
you
just
know.
stand. What? How many feet away was it?
It's 6 feet, right?
6 feet.
So
Yeah, yeah,
and then wear a mask, protect yourself. And that was a little bit of uh misinformation because masks only filter what you exhale. Particulates.
yeah,
To filter what you inhale is a respirator. People involved in the restoration industries know that. You're doing mold remediation or
yeah.
toxic floodwaters or whatever. You have to wear a respirator because you got to filter what you're inhaling, not what you're exhaling. But we put the whole world onto masks, and people did it thinking they were protecting themselves.
Yep.
And really, what they were doing perhaps is protecting those around them if they were in fact infected. But that was a little bit of misinformation, and people that sold masks
Yep.
sold a lot of them.
Well,
So,
hey, we were disinfecting fruit and vegetables. Come on.
yeah, right, right. That's crazy. In fact, one of the things that was being used, they were using electrostatic sprayers to do all that, kind of walk into the room and wave it around. And we had some issues regarding the validity. We
Well, yeah, we put out some pretty controversial stuff about electrostatic sprayers because as we said, and it's still true, most of what was being sold back then didn't do anything that they said it was doing. Wasn't
And how
even
did we reveal that? That's the question. Through what website?
germ washing and Jancast, obviously, too.
Yeah.
But we were nice enough to have Steve Cooper called us up or emailed us saying, "Yo, you put us in the same field with all those other pieces of equipment that didn't work, that shocked you and everything else. Remember that one that we got, Mark, that if you touched it at a certain spot, you'd get a shock through your body."
I surely do remember that. I remember we joked about it in one of our Jancasts about what a shocking experience it was. But and then we brought it up to Steve Cooper, who is a scientist, by the
Right.
way. He's a
Yeah.
research and development scientist and developed electrostatic spraying for the tanning industry. And then he carried that over
Yeah.
into the disinfection. And he validated the fact that if it's done right, it works. And we knew that from the paint industry.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, it's how they paint cars. But a lot of what was out there was not doing what it said.
Well,
And
boy, how about all the poor people? How about all the poor people that invested and get brought in hundreds of thousands of those green machine gun looking sprayers?
I was wondering if you were going to call them out. But yeah, I know.
Yeah, I mean, you got to give them credit for creating a need for a product that didn't even work. And then all those poor people got stuck with it. I know a distributor up in New England that he probably still has a 8 or 9 pallets of that stuff. And what are you going to do with it? Other than maybe you could use it for spraying your plants or something. But it's kind
Yeah.
of expensive for that purpose. But
Yeah. And the other thing that we found out, because you and I are involved with testing different electrostatic
yeah,
units, some of them were charged in one way, others were
yeah,
delivering a reverse
that's
charge.
right. Yeah,
And that was odd. So beyond the fact that some of them would shock you, some of them were just backwards in terms of the polarities that they were dispensing. And the other end of it that even dates back before COVID is that the worry was, do people know what stay wet, dry time really means? And are they getting that when they spray it out?
right.
And in a lot of cases, people were confirming the fact that walking into a room, whipping a sprayer around, there was no contact time happening.
Right.
So they were really doing a term. What's that term again, Scott? Hygiene theater. So, I mean, it was all done really to kind of make people think they were doing the right thing when in
Yeah.
fact they weren't going through the proper process that the EPA would have registered those disinfectants to do.
Well, people had no idea what dwell time was. I mean,
Yeah,
I guess
right.
if you really knew what you're doing, you did, but most people just figured, and that's just one part. I mean, people also thought if you used more of a product than the recommended dilution rate, it would be better. Well, that isn't true either because the EPA work is all done based on a specific dilution rate and whether or not it has efficacy at that dilution rate. So, yeah, some crazy stuff going on back then. People spraying down their whole bodies with stuff. People selling disinfectants on the side of the road. You bring your own bottle and they'd fill it up with stuff. I mean, come
Do
on.
you remember when we were doing? I just remembered this, Scott, where in China or Japan or somewhere they had a giant booth where all the workers had to go into this
Yeah,
booth
yeah.
and get sprayed with bleach,
They
and then
got
they
like
come out
fogged
the other
down before
side.
they went to work or before well, people used to do it when they'd get home from work. People would spray themselves down before they
Yeah,
walk in the house. I mean, some
crazy stuff. Crazy
crazy
stuff.
stuff. So then 22, we got more into people kind of looked at this whole thing and said, hold on here, this is crazy, and got into indoor air quality, which ends up being an extremely important part of the whole process that nobody knew about beforehand.
If we'd have actually been up on some of the ability that we now have to monitor indoor air quality,
Yeah,
um, we didn't really have all that technology or didn't have it suited to determine whether there were pathogenics in the air. But we found out that 80% of the contagious transmission rate was airborne.
yep,
So we're running around disinfecting surfaces, we meaning all of society in general,
yep.
disinfecting surfaces 50 times a day, but ignoring the air and closing schools as a result. And I think you made a comment on a previous Jancast one time that If we'd have known that, we would have dealt with the air. We wouldn't even have probably had to close all our
Yeah.
schools.
Yeah, that was something we learned from Dinesh, who Think Light Air came in and talked about. You probably know the particulars, but what wasn't some fact about if they didn't let people back into the room after they did their disinfecting for a time period, that dramatically reduced the potential infection? Or
Yeah, that fascinated me a lot. The
yeah,
act of cleaning, even if you're doing things exactly right,
yep,
the act of cleaning is a disruption to things that have landed on surfaces, and it broadcasts it into the air, into the breathing space. And so their studies showed that if they waited 12 minutes was the amount of time, Scott,
yeah, that was it. Yeah,
12 minutes allowed what got broadcast into the air through the act of cleaning to precipitate back out of the air and not being an inhalation hazard to the students coming in to have lunch. When they're wiping down, uh, that's where the study happened in a school
yeah.
where they were wiping down the cafeteria tables and watching the indoor air quality and
Well, in
deciding.
some of the cases, they had the students doing the wiping down, so they're like
Yeah.
right in the middle of the whole thing, thinking they're doing good, which they're actually potentially putting themselves in more potential harm because they're stirring things up.
Well, your average high school student and junior high school student is certified in the arts and sciences of cleaning and disinfection, right?
Yeah, you've taught many of them, right?
So the more amazing thing to me is, not only did we see that happening in high schools, but we saw, um, even prior to COVID, a movement to get college students cleaning their own dorms and cleaning their own areas. And I've always had a problem with people doing it thinking there's nothing to it. Who can't clean? My kids
Right.
clean. But there is a right way and a wrong way, and especially when it comes down to cleaning for health.
Yep.
It's one thing to make things look clean, but it's another thing to make sure that it's either sanitized or disinfected. So cleaning for health has been the big movement, and you don't know that automatically.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. So
So
we went through 23. Let's see, make sure we didn't miss anything. So I think like I covered that. So it's 2023. It was just you couldn't get anything. It kind of started to stabilize. Inventory kind of caught up with it, which is completely different than if you didn't listen to the last Jancast. I kind of talk about the difference between the supply chain issues of the pandemic and the supply chain issues that we're now going to be seeing or already seeing because of the excursion in the Middle East.
yes, I remember the term you used was something about a velocity crisis.
Yes, correct.
So, right?
Yeah, yeah, pretty
It's something
interesting.
like
So I thought that show was pretty interesting just because my
yeah.
AI assistant kind of really got into it a lot more than.
I'm jealous of your AI assistant, just for the record.
Well, they're scraping stuff from the internet, probably some of your stuff, Mark.
I don't know. They seem so much smarter than me.
Yeah.
So
So
anyway,
increase in technology in 24. We've got a
we had
couple of
John Hill
yeah.
involved with that. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, and that well, I've done a Jancast on that too. So we have all these automatic autonomous floor scrubbers out there. You can't get your car fixed in a timely manner. Who's fixing all these auto scrubbers? So I gotta get John Hill back on again to kind of talk about. Okay, so we got this new revolution of all this stuff doing kind of working by itself, but what happens when it breaks?
Right, right, right. And
Yeah,
that was that great Jancast and an SSB too. So
yeah, yeah,
Um, and that was the mechanical part of the robotics. The other
yeah,
part that we did talk about back in 2024 was the increase in popularity of measurement tools
yeah,
for
yeah.
surface cleanliness. And that led us down the path of talking about ATP meters. And
Hmm.
we had Bob Ferguson of Kikkoman on the show talking about how all the varieties of ATP meters out there and how they work and what they detect and what they don't, which
Yeah,
is also interesting
yeah.
because they will detect the presence of organic material even if it's dead,
It's
right?
kind of and I don't want to say anything bad about ATP meters, but it's kind of giving you a false hope that you've done something. But I guess it's better than nothing. Right? Is that a nice
Yeah,
way?
and a lower cost. I mean, what we used to do in healthcare years ago was swab testing, and you'd go around and you'd swab an area out and you'd mail it off. It cost $60, and they would do a swab culture and determine whether or not there was any bacteria there, and in fact, what kind. But when you talk about doing a swab culture test in a room, you could do 10 areas of testing. You could test the floor area and above the floor surfaces, walls and instruments. That's 10. Doorknobs and, that's easy 10. That's $600.
Hmm. Yeah.
And the idea of ATP, even though the units went for over a grand, the tests themselves were down around $2.
Yep.
So it allowed for more ongoing testing rather than periodic, because you're in the hospital getting your appendix taken out in surgery. It's kind of sucks to get a call 3 days later saying, "Oh, I hate to tell you this, Mark, but the swab cultures came back from the OR table and they didn't read good." Well, I had my surgery 2 days ago. Well, sorry to tell you. But,
Well, at least right?
Yes, I mean with ATP, at least it's 15 seconds. You got a reading.
Yeah.
Gives you,
as long as they do it right, because there's obviously a right and wrong way of doing it, and I remember people like doing, waving the swab thing around, and there's a very specific way you have to, depending upon the machine, obviously, depending on how you do it, right?
I remember teaching a class one time, and somebody came out with a swab and said, check this out in your ATP meter. I'm like, why? What'd you do to it? Yeah, I swabbed everything in the whole bathroom. I'm like, well, what's that
Good
gonna
luck with
tell
that,
you?
right?
Yeah, I mean, technically it's 4 inch by 4 inch or 2 inch by 2 inch,
Yeah,
depending on
right.
what model it is. And there's a path. You do it one way, then the other way. You rotate it, and then you've got to measure it so that it's in a static position. You can't move the machine around or it'll read differently. And there's a whole lot of things you got to do right to do a proper test. But
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, Scott, were running around swabbing everything, sticking them up their nose and everything else, and trying to use that as some trend analysis, and it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, yeah.
But it did open the door for some hyperspectral imaging cameras.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I mean, they're $30,000 to $50,000 setups, and companies sprung up to provide subscription services to healthcare to be able to use cameras to document whether or not surfaces were safe. We have some friends up in Canada that did that pretty well.
Yeah.
So, that was kind of also probably a springboard with COVID, and all of a sudden everybody wanting some verification and validation regarding what was done. Don't just tell me you sent somebody in there to disinfect, and prove to me that they're delivering back to me a disinfected surface, right? So that's verification and validation. So that ATP and hyperspectral imaging all got a springboard effect off of that period of time. And it was the following year, Scott, when, if you remember, when we really started getting into all the standards.
Yeah. Yep. Which you were a big part of.
Yeah, well, I tried to be. I know that in 2025, I was involved with the S400 Cleaning Standard Committee and the S410 Infection Control Standard Committee. And the Infection Control Standard Committee, we had Jancast guest on. Remember Graham Dick, and he was the chair of the S410, and that was all about verification and validation. Don't tell me you did it right. Prove to me you're delivering a disinfected surface, right?
Yep.
So all of that came about after COVID started. That committee didn't start until after COVID happened in 2020, and it took until last year for it to actually get released.
Yep.
It got released last year, and he was involved. I mean, brilliant guy, Graham Dick. And the co-chair was Mark Drozdoff. We've had Mark Drozdoff on as a Jancast guest prior to. He was also an ISO auditor for, manufacturing, for doing ISO audits. And the other very, very well-known folks that were in that committee, I don't mean me, but we had Keith Sofa, who runs the Clean Learning organization in Canada, probably one of the most well-known instructional training programs used in and outside healthcare, higher ed as well, all throughout Canada. And he was very vocal and very powerful piece of that committee. I was there representing the S400 cleaning standard to make sure that there was some degree of coordination between
Hmm.
cleaning and disinfection, terminology, and things like that. The S400 was made up of a lot of people that we've talked about over the years, Scott. You remember Bo Bodo? You remember
Yeah,
Gary Clipperton?
yeah.
Barry Shimanoff? Todd Stone King helped write the cleaning provision area standards, aka custodial closet. And
Mhm.
some of the other folks on there, Bill Griffin and Lee Center, we've talked about those names before.
Yep.
All kind of iconic names that were part of that. Anyway, I wanted to throw those names out because
Yep.
credit's due. All
That's
those
in.
folks, me included, spent 5 years weekly for an hour a week for 5 years, got
Well,
paid nothing to just try to elevate the standards of the industry. So
well,
that's credit where credit's due.
I remember reminding you a couple times, hey, you got to get ready to leave because you got to get on that call.
Yeah, right, right.
Cool. So things that are now kind of settled down. Now we're in the middle of people kind of know what they're doing. Now we've got all these mergers and acquisitions that I guess we kind of hit the pinnacle with the Brady Plus and the Imperial Dade finally officially merging, right?
Yeah,
Um,
well, I saw in a press release that's a big deal. I mean, it makes them the biggest entity like that ever in the history of mankind in the type of janitorial and sanitary maintenance supply chain.
yeah,
And Jason Tillis, who we've known for many, many
yeah,
years
yeah.
as part of Imperial Dade, is now acting president of Brady Plus.
Yeah.
And the
Congratulations, Jason.
yeah, congratulations, Jason, for sure.
Yeah,
And then he is supported through the past president of Brady Plus is now his vice president, senior vice president. I believe he has a role. Both of them have a role on the board of directors for the guidance, and both
yeah.
Scott, both very smart people, very brilliant people. Can't can't underestimate that. So, kind of thought I'd put that out there.
Yeah, it's interesting since we're a manufacturer, Bullen's a manufacturer of cleaning products, and we're not in distribution. We sell through distribution. We thought with all the mergers and acquisitions, we were, a few years ago, we were thinking this is going to be terrible. It's really going to like kill our business off. And if you're not one of the suppliers of one of these big, huge companies, you're out of luck. But quite honestly, I think it's ended up being a lot different than people imagine. There's, still a lot of independent distributors out there, and yeah, there's going to be a place for the huge companies, but there's still a place for the smaller distributors that can serve on that different level. So it's not all doom and gloom because of the M&A stuff, at least from our perspective.
Well, I think that I'm a big believer that the difference in companies really isn't necessarily their mission or their platform, it's the people.
Yep. Yep.
And when you think about the supply chain, there are two kinds of buyers. There's buyers that buy based on price, and there's buyers that want to buy based on performance. The
Hmm.
problem with trying to sell performance is you've got to spend a lot of time and effort to educate the customer
Yeah.
for them to buy based on performance, because otherwise most buyers will minimize risk by buying the lowest cost item. So if they're going to justify buying something that costs more, they need to be educated about what makes them different. And I think there's people that are in both big organizations like Brady Plus and a lot of small organizations that excel in the ability to educate their customer.
Yeah.
And that's why I think there'll always be a place for both the big dogs and all of the, up and coming smaller to mid-sized distributors that want to differentiate themselves from their competitors by being more knowledgeable.
Yep. Yep.
That's okay.
Well, when we did go, we kind of didn't touch on it, but when the pandemic hit, it used to be the a typical Jansan sales guy from like a Bullen sales guy would go do ride with the distributor salespeople. That was the standard for generating business. You ride along with them and go make the calls with them. The pandemic hit, that completely stopped, obviously, because nobody even wanted to let people in the building. But since everything's kind of calmed down, that really, I mean, that part of the sales process is really never came back to what it used to be. So that education part's extremely important, and that's where AI and all this other stuff really comes into play to kind of get the word out because people are still looking for good price and also looking for good service and everything else. But how do you even get in touch with the customer if you don't call on them anymore?
I remember talking with a Bullen sales rep, Mel Dean of Mel Dean Associates, back a
Hmm.
couple years ago, who started going out and making the end user calls. And I remember asking him, like, how are you being received? Right? Because people were afraid to do that for so long. And he said, they're so happy to see a living person. And he found that, arms wide open. It was red carpet treatment. They were just so happy to see somebody coming back into their building and helping them go call on their
Yeah.
customers.
And
So,
he's still doing that. He's a road warrior, that guy.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
no doubt.
Yeah, but then his customers expect it. So what to close out, you're a industry know-it-all?
No, not at
What's
all.
happening? What's the new stuff?
So for
What's
the
coming
record,
down the
Scott,
line?
for the record, I study the industry and you know it. So thank you for that. But the more you study anything, the more you learn you don't know.
Hmm.
So I would never claim to know it all, but
Yeah.
what do we get wrong? The whole hygiene theater thing of making
Yeah.
people think we were making it safe when we really weren't. We were probably spreading disease instead of getting rid of it.
Yep.
That we got wrong. Like it's no good to fake it. You got to really do it for real, and that changed the industry into verification and validation. And then, the other thing we got wrong was the whole concept of running around where we're safe. We got masks on. That
Yeah.
was wrong.
Yep.
But we got some things right too, Scott. And
Yep.
that was it elevated the cleaning industry to this stage where
Yeah.
the cleaning industry was in the spotlight. And some of the talented people in the cleaning industry were kind of elevated in the spotlight for what they were doing and how they were doing it. I know that I received some kudos from time to time for what I was doing with educating and the idea that there was a greater need now for people to have some form of documentation that they know the best practices for cleaning and disinfection. So I think that's never going to go back. I think everybody now fully expects things to be cleaner than they ever were,
Yeah.
and they're expecting to have it proven to them.
Yep. Yep.
You
Well,
know,
all good stuff. So that's the history of 6 years, all in one fantastic Jancast with Mark Warner and Scott Jones.
this was so much fun. Hey, will you please have me back again soon?
Sure, you bet, buddy. I'll mix you in with the AIs.
I don't know about that. They'll make me look bad.
The cool thing about those AIs, and those of you that haven't seen any of the Janecasts I've done recently, the newer ones incorporate video so nicely into what they're talking about. I said something the other day, like how did we actually operate without ChatGPT and GPS and all the, I mean, it's just mind-boggling, all the technology. It's like I had to take an Uber home yesterday, and I went out to the office and said, I just can't believe the fact that I can just call up a car on my phone and it tells me where it is and how many minutes away it is. I mean, it's mind-boggling. And so who knows what's going to happen with all the stuff that's coming down the pike? Probably better. It's going to be better. Definitely. It's not going to be worse. Technology is going to help us.
I got to say that I think we're entering into one of the most exciting times there's ever been to be involved with the cleaning industry
Yeah.
in any capacity because of the speed of the new evolution of all this technology. It's fantastic. It's exciting as hell, and I'm glad to be here. So,
Okay, on that note, thank you very much. And this one's going down in the history books. So 10 years from now, people can listen to us talking about what happened 6 years ago or
you
26
got it.
years ago or whatever it happens to be, just like all the hundreds of Jancast shows. So thank you very much, Mark. We will definitely have you back and stay safe out there. Safe travels. It's warming up finally. No snow. Looking forward to summer, right?
You bet.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay. See y'all.